Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Exploring Photography right here on Adorama TV. I'm Mark Wallace. Today I'm going to show you the flash exposure triangle. It's a little bit different than the normal exposure triangle. In fact, you can sort of think of this as the exposure diamond, because when you add a flash to your camera, you no longer have one exposure, you have two. You have the ambient light, which is what we're going to be doing with this big window over here, lots of light coming in. That's ambient light, light from the sun or light from your environment, the light that we have to react to. That's what we use the normal exposure triangle to control. And then we have light from our flash. So we've got a flash right here. That's a different exposure triangle. And so when you're using a flash in the studio, you only have to worry about the flash exposure triangle. And when you're using your camera with no flash outside, you only have to worry about the exposure triangle. But what happens when you're trying to mix those two things, ambient light and light from the flash? Well, you can change different things to either increase or decrease the exposure from our ambient light or increase or decrease the light from the flash. And those two things can work independent of each other. And so that's where our flash triangle becomes a flash diamond, because those two things join and we have, well, you'll see in just a minute. Our model is here, it's Juana! Okay, before I show you how everything is set up, let me remind you the photos I'm going to show you in this video are for us to understand the principles of the photography and how everything works. It's not something you'd want to hang on the wall. Over here on this side of the room, we have tons of ambient light coming in. So we have this giant window letting in tons of light from the sun. That is controlled by our normal exposure triangle. That is our ISO, our aperture, and our shutter speed. On this side over here, we have a flash. That flash is controlled by a different exposure triangle, the flash exposure triangle. That is our ISO, our aperture, and the power of our flash, the flash power. Now, the cool thing is we can control these two exposures independent of each other. So I can change the exposure over here to make the background brighter or darker, that ambient light. I can change the flash power to make the flash exposure brighter or darker. And so we're going to walk through all of that stuff. The thing to remember is that both exposure triangles share two things, the ISO and the aperture. They both affect the ambient and our flash. So we need to lock those in and not change them. We only want to change our shutter and the flash power to change those two exposures. All right, so we're going to begin with our ambient light. So I have my ISO at 100, my aperture at 16, and then my shutter speed is going to be at 60th of a second to begin with. So, Juana, aquí y no movimiento. My Spanish is so bad. All right, I've got this all focused up. Okay, so I'm going to shoot at 60th of a second. Then I'm going to shoot another one here at, let's do 125th of a second, so half that. We'll do another one here, maybe 180th of a second. And we look at those, you can clearly see that the background is getting a little bit darker, a little bit darker, and a little bit darker. All right, I like the 60th of a second, so I'm going to go back there, set my exposure to 60th of a second. Now what I want to do is I want to turn on my flash and meter this so that the flash matches my exposure triangle. So really what we need to do is make sure that it meters at f16 so that the flash and the ambient light are balanced. I do that by changing the one variable in our flash exposure triangle that is not in our normal exposure triangle. That's the flash power. So let's start. So what I'm going to do here is I've got this little remote control. It allows me to change the power and trigger the flash, all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my meter and I'm going to meter this. So I'm metering it right here. And that meters at f16, that is perfect. So if I had not enough light, so let's say I metered this, that's f13. So let's say it's f13 to begin with. What I need to do is use my remote or the power on the back of that and just increase that until that meters at f16. Once that's set, then my two exposures are equal, they match. So it'll balance all that stuff. So now what I can do here is I can put this remote on my flash. This is where it gets fun. Okay, Juana, perfecto y no movimiento. Perfecto. So here's the first shot, and you can see that those are balanced. Now what I'll do is I'm going to roll my shutter speed down to 30th of a second, and go down to 15th of a second. I'm going to take that up to 125th of a second, up to 180th of a second. Now look at these images. what you'll see is that the ambient light exposure is changing, but the flash exposure is not. That's because we're only changing that one variable in our exposure triangle that's not in our flash exposure triangle, the shutter. So that's affecting our ambient light, but it has no effect on our studio strobe. Now what I'm going to do here is the opposite. So I'm going to set my shutter back at 60th of a second. Now what I'm going to do is, por favor, numero uno. So Juana's going to put her finger up. Number one, that's a proper exposure. Then I'm going to take my flash output down. Numero dos. Okay. I'm going to take my flash output down considerably. Numero tres. Okay. Now when we look at these, notice that the flash exposure is changing, but the ambient exposure is not. We can change and control these two exposures independent of each other, knowing our flash exposure triangle and our normal exposure triangle, joining them to make an exposure diamond. I guess that's what you would call it. Shutter speed controls the ambient light. Flash power controls the output of their flash. We can control those independent of each other. That's all there is to it. Now, I know there's much more to it, flash duration and sync speed and all that kind of stuff. So make sure you look at the links in the description of this video to really fully understand everything that's involved, understanding why we chose a certain aperture and shutter speed and all that stuff. Links in the description of this video. It explains everything. Thank you, Juana, for all this fun we've had today. And don't forget to subscribe to Adorama TV. There's tons of videos. There's live streams coming, so make sure you click on the bell to get notifications. You don't want to miss out on that. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll see you again next time.